Hello everyone, I'm reading the Bible story of Ruth, the Israel Gentile heroine. Actually, I already have this in my other videos, but because that one is a mixed story, because when I read that story is book by book, so like for example in the book of Genesis, uh, there's too many story there, like the story in the beginning, the story of Abraham, Noah, and Joseph. So the video is so long, so they didn't like to watch that long. So that's why they said, "Can you read like story by story?" So now I'm reading story by story. So the stories today is Ruth, Israel Gentile heroine. So that's our story for today. So a young widow from the hated land of Moab achieved an honored place among the Israelites by placing compassion and family loyalty above all ties to her homeland. So the story of Ruth's devotion to her family provides a warm and peaceful interlude in the history of an otherwise warlike age. So an alien and penniless Moabite widow, she won the love of a prominent citizen of Judah and eventually married him. One of her descendants, David, became Israel's greatest king. So Ruth's tale is set in Judah. So in the day when the judges ruled, about the 12th century, not 20th, 12th century BC, many years had passed since the Israelites had crossed the Jordan and formed a loose tribal confederacy in the central highlands of Canaan. So as they established their own settlements, they gradually discarded their nomadic traditions and adopted an agricultural way of life. Yet their position remained precarious. The northern tribes were almost constantly at war with those walled cities that remained under the control of the Canaanites, and they frequently had to defend themselves against invasion by people from the east. The Ammonites and Midianites, in contrast, Judah, which occupied the southern end of the Israelites' territory, so seems to have been relatively tranquil and not involved in the great wars that concerned the judges. So the people of Judah regularly battled another sort of enemy. So the climate. So Judah occupied a rugged plateau in the semi-arid lands west of the Dead Sea. So normally, the land was fertile enough to sustain fields of wheat and barley, grape vineyards and groves, olives, and fig trees. But occasionally, the rains fell, the crops withered, and there was a famine. During one such disaster, a Judean man named Elimelech, who lived in the town of Bethlehem, fled that land with his wife, Naomi, and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. So the family traveled to Moab, a kingdom on the eastern borders of the Dead Sea. So the distance was not great, perhaps 30 to 40 miles along the edge of that inland sea. Nevertheless, it was a long journey spiritually. Both the Israelites and Moabites traced their ancestry back to the family of Abraham, and they spoke dialects of the same language. But the Moabites worshiped a different god, Chemosh, with rites regarded as sinful by the people of Judah. So this religious difference, along with political rivalry, was the source of century-long friction between the two peoples. So before the Israelites first entered Canaan, attractive Moabite women seduced many of the Israelite warriors, and even enticed them with sacrificing to Chemosh. Angered the God of Israel, sent down a flood, so killing the sinners and thousands of other Israelites. So the people of Israel still spoke harshly of Moabite women. So it is not clear why Elimelech chose Moab as a refuge. So certainly he was aware that it was a fertile land with an ample rainfall where he was like to prosper. So there may also have been some personal or commercial connection that made it possible for him to lease farmland or transact business. So at any rate, it was in Moab that he once again took up the broken threads of his life. So ironically, he died soon afterward, leaving his 2 sons to carry on. Despite traditional enmities, each married a Moabite girl. Chilion was wed to Orpah, and Mahlon married Ruth. For a number of years, life was comfortable for them. Then the sons died too, and the 3 widows, Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, faced a very uncertain future. In those days, women could not inherit property directly. They could only hold it in a kind of trust for some future husband for another male relative. So women had virtually no way of earning a living. So without husband or family, they were sure to become dependent upon the charity of others. So the 2 younger women, Orpah and Ruth, at least were among their own people and might have had families to look after them. So moreover, both were still young enough to find new husbands among the men of Moab. Next harvest in Judah. So Naomi, however, was a stranger in the land and was past the age when she could reasonably expect to bear children. So no man was likely to choose her as a wife. So when she heard that the Lord had favored Judah with rich harvest once more, so she decided to return to Bethlehem. So among her own people, there might be more concern for her welfare. So sadly, she gathered her meager belongings and began the trip back. But the 2 younger women insisted on going with her. So Naomi pleaded with them to turn back, since she knew full well that she could not take care of them. So she may also have feared that her daughters-in-law, as Moabite women, would receive a hostile reception in Judah. So Orpah gave in at last and carefully kissed Naomi goodbye. But Ruth would not be swayed. Entreat me not to leave you or to return from following you, she insisted. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. I will go, and your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will be I buried. So Naomi could offer no protest against such devotion. The 2 women went on to Bethlehem together. The journey lasted 4 or 5 days. So after bidding farewell to Orpah on the fertile rolling plain of Moab, so the women continued northward to the southern end of Jordan River. So near Jericho, they forded the river and headed westward through the hot, desolate wilderness of Judah. So at last, the grassy hills of central Judah came into sight. So before them lay the village of Bethlehem, its humble whitewashed houses huddled together on the other side of a hill. So below town stretched fields of ripening grain. So the 2 women entered the town and soon found lodging they could afford. So their arrival coincided with the beginning of the spring grain harvest, a 7-week period lasting from mid-April to about mid-June. So they found that what Naomi had heard was true. So the time of famine in Judah was long past, and the rains that year had been particularly plentiful. So a large supply of grain waited to be gathered. Barley first, then wheat a few weeks later. Harvesting was difficult work and demanded long hours. Young men moved through the fields grasping handfuls of the grain and cutting through the stalks with sickles. So these small bunches of grain were then bound into the bundles called sheaves. So as the men worked rapidly, a number of stalks fell to the ground. If the men worked carefully and took the time, these too could be gathered up. So however, any stalk that dropped were allowed to remain where they fell. So for people following the reapers were permitted to glean or gather the random stalks, possibly all that stood between them and starvation. So in addition, the edge of the field where the sickle was not easily welded, so were left unharvested. The poor were welcome to that portion as well. So the destitute of Bethlehem now included Ruth and Naomi, and Ruth offered to go into the fields and glean. It was no light offer, so stopping for the occasional stalks over and over in the hot sun all day was back-breaking labor. There were also young harvesters who did not always treat undefended women gently. So a Moabite girl would almost certainly be a target for abuse. So yet, there seemed to be no other way of eking out a food supply. So Naomi was simply too old to do it herself. So, with considerable reluctance, she conceded to the young woman wished to join the gleaners. This is when they go harvesting. Now Naomi had a kinsman of her husband, so a man of wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So and Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set forth and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. As Ruth worked her way through the barley fields outside Bethlehem, she eventually reached the property of Boaz. So he had come out from the cities to supervise the harvest and noticed the unfamiliar girl working so hard in his field. "So whose maiden is this?" Boaz asked his men. One of them answered, "It is the Moabite maiden who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And then men told him how she had worked without rest since early morning. So they may have related to this with a grudging respect. So any girl from Moab would not have appeared admirable in the eyes of these Israelites. Next is a prosperous farmer. So Boaz, however, reacted with compassion, remembered Naomi as the widow of Elimelech, who was his own kinsman, and he knew her story. So perhaps he felt embarrassed that he had done so little for Naomi. So Boaz, obviously impressed by Ruth's devotion, told her to glean only in his field and to remain with the woman he employed. See, he also promised to warn his men not to molest her. "Now listen, my daughter," he told her gently. "Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my maidens." Excuse me. "Let your eyes be upon the field which they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to molest you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me when I am foreigner?" So Boaz reassured her, saying, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and come to a people that you did not know before. So the Lord recompense you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take a refuge. So Ruth thanked him, and with such grace that Boaz invited her to join him and his workmen at the midday meal. As she sat among the harvesting crew, he offered her bread and allowed her to dip into the wine, a special treat. So he himself placed helping of parched grain before her. So when the meal was over, Boaz discreetly instructed his men to drop grain wherever Ruth was gleaning. By the end of the day, Ruth found that she had collected a surprising quantity of barley. She gathered it up in her veil, that mantle of heavy cloth that women of that time wore draped around the head and shoulders, and took home to Naomi. So the other woman stared at the heap of grain with disbelief. How could Ruth have managed to glean all that? In all, she had gathered half a bushel of grain. Ruth recounted the day's events, and Naomi was overjoyed. Boaz, she said, was treating Ruth as a kinswoman. So Naomi must have feared that Boaz would have no interest in caring for an old woman past the age of childbearing. Apparently, he was a concern after all. What is more, he did so such a delicate fashion that there was no humiliation attached to his act of charity. Next is levirate marriage. So Naomi was concerned with more than the gathering of grain. So she began to think of practice that then prevailed in Israel called levirate marriage. The custom ensured that security of She began to think of practice that then prevailed in Israel called levirate marriage, from a word meaning husband's brother. So the custom ensured the security of widow who might otherwise be left destitute and friendless. So under it, any childless widow had the right to expect her dead husband's brother to marry her. If no brother existed, some more distant male relative was required to perform his duty. So whichever relative married the widow became her Goel, redeemer or protector. The first son born to the widow by new marriage was counted as a child of a dead husband and inherited his property. So Naomi, past childbearing age, could not hope for such a marriage, so she had not thought it possible for Ruth. So either knowing that a Moabite woman would probably be looked upon with contempt, but now Boaz's interest in her daughter-in-law might make it possible after all. So the timing was fortunate. So immediately after the harvest, the farmers assembled to thresh and winnow the grain, a happy time when Boaz might be most receptive to such an idea. So to thresh the grain, that is, to separate kernels from stalks, the worker first scattered the sheaves over the threshing floor, a dry, hard, flat piece of ground. So they then beat the stalks with fels or drove a team of oxen over them. So the process was often speeded up by hitching the animals to wooden sledge which had knobs of stone or metal attached to the underside. So the scraping of the sledge loosened the kernels and broke the dry stalk into the straw bits or shafts. So the men winnowed the mixture of grain and chaff by lifting it on a 5 or 6 pronged fork or fan-like shovel and tossing into the air. So breezes caught the light chaff and dust and blew it aside. So the heavier grains of barley or wheat fell back to the ground. The winnowing was generally done in the late afternoon and early evening, when the warm breezes from the Mediterranean blew. When the winnowing was finished, groups of women sifted the grain through the sieves to separate the last bits of chaff and other impurities from the grain. So the sieves were made of brown wooden frames and fine leather mesh, with holes so small that only the purified grain could pass through. Once the grain had been sifted, it was collected in the large earthenware pots for storage. When harvests were good, the time of threshing and winnowing was an occasion for celebration. So the grain had been safely gathered, and there would be plenty to eat that year. As the farmers and their workers waited their turns to use the communal threshing floor, they joined in laughing, singing, and feasting. So, and because the labor took several days, they usually planned on remaining overnight. So since Boaz would take part in these festivities, Naomi felt it would be an ideal atmosphere in which to remind him of his family duty. So she told Ruth to wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes and go down into the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he had finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say I will do. So that night, when all was quiet, Ruth cautiously approached the spot where Boaz slept. So she lifted his blanket and covered his feet and lay down there. By lying at his feet, she was appealing to him to become her co-well and provide the protection due her as a widow of his kinsman. Next is the public agreement. So at midnight, Boaz awoke. He was startled to find Ruth at his feet. So who are you? He asked. I am Ruth, your maid-servant, she replied. Spread your skirt over your maid-servant, for you are next of kin. Boaz, who was middle-aged, was flattered that this charming young woman had turned to him for protection, and he was quite willing to do what was required. So he was a man of principle. However, and pointed out that there was another kinsman, a closer relative, who took precedence as a goel. So that man must first be offered in his chance. So as morning approached, Boaz insisted that Ruth leave while it was still dark. So he did not wish any of the men to see her. As she left, he said, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. And he gave her a large heap of threshed and winnowed barley to take home. So Boaz wasted no time in making good his promise. So later that morning, he went to the city gate of Bethlehem, center of the town's public life. So almost anyone could be found there at some time during the day. It was the spot where caravans arrived, where farmers and herdsmen gathered to buy and sell, perhaps just to gossip. So merchants bartered and tradesmen spread their wares on the ground, sometimes under a canopy. So the city's elders also met at the gate, where they functioned as justice of the peace, where they settled property disputes and judges a wide variety of crimes and ranging from theft of livestock to murder. So if the elder decided the accused was guilty, he was punished on the spot. So Boaz did not have to wait long before the kinsman he sought came by. He called him over and summoned 10 of the elders to to witness the transaction he had in mind. So Naomi, he explained, held some land of her late husband, which out of poverty she would have to sell. Would the near kinsman purchase it in order to keep the property from passing out of the family possessions? So the kinsman readily agreed to do so. But Boaz went on, if the kinsman were to do that, he would also be obligated to a levirate marriage with Naomi's daughter-in-law. So he would assume responsibility as her whatever. So the kinsman balked at this. So if he married Ruth, the tract of land would eventually be passed along the first son she might have by him. So I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance, he said. So take my right of redemption yourself. So to bind the matter legally, the kinsman had to remove his sandal and hand it to Boaz. So a gesture signifying the transfer of property. So Boaz held up the sandals so that the elders could see it and bear witness to the contract. So he had acquired all the property that Elimelech and his son had owned, and Ruth the Moabites. So the widow of Mahlon was to be his wife. So Boaz soon married Ruth. So a loving, devoted wife, she remained unfaithful daughter-in-law as well, and Naomi was properly taking care of the rest of her life. When Ruth bore a son, Naomi proudly held it in her arms for everyone to see. Legally, he counted as her grandson. Sons were held in much higher esteem than daughter. So the admiring women of Bethlehem paid Ruth their supreme compliment, saying to Naomi, your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him. So the happy ending of the tale of Naomi and Ruth was also an important beginning. So Ruth's son was Obed, who was the father of Jesse, and he in turn fathered David, who was to become the Israelites' conquering hero, the leader of who himself fostered a line of rulers that would endure over 400 years. Centuries later, after the return of the Jews from their exile in Babylon, the Greek scribe Ezra demanded that Jewish men divorce foreign wives. This harsh policy was an attempt to purify Israel's society of alien influences. So the demand caused much sorrow. So it was about this time that the book of Ruth first appeared, a plea for compassion and religious tolerance. So the story of Ruth is told also in the book of Ruth. So that's all the story of Ruth, the heroine, the Israel heroine. I hope you like because Ruth is a Gentile. And I hope you like the story. God bless everyone. Bye.